Welcome to the Singularity Syndicate podcast, where we bring together leaders, researchers, innovators, and intellectuals to discuss transformative technologies shaping our future. I'm Naja Faysal. Amy Patel, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So the first thing on your LinkedIn is the word Rockstar, and not only on your LinkedIn, but also the friend who introduced us to each other also says that you're the rock star of product management. Could you tell us the backstory of that?
Sure. I have zero musical capability, so nothing compared to an actual rock star. But I think people started calling me this when I was in consulting at IBM, doing business and strategy consulting. So for anyone who's been in consulting pre-pandemic, it was quite intense. A lot of hard work, a lot of travel, very intense. But I loved it. It was very energizing to me. And so people started using this term to describe me. I was handed really difficult problems in the technical space for life sciences and healthcare and constantly doing whatever it takes to solve the problems. And so that's where it started. And then just kept hearing that word again and again, rock star. Yeah.
I want to know more about product management because this term has been tossed around and used in so many different ways. So could you help us uncover what this term means?
Sure. Thank you for asking. It's so nice that people know what that term is now and hear about product because it's different than IT. And so it's important to know. So product management is really a lot of the intersection between business needs and technology, right? So a lot of the times at software companies, product leaders are really the ones that are communicating, working every day with the engineers that are coding the software, that are solving the problems, that are creating what we want to create. And then also working at the intersectionality with maybe the CEOs, the strategy officers, the finance folks, and things like that, trying to understand how do we solve a crux of a problem. And then also working really closely with customers and externally. So product is really the connective tissue between a lot of these different functions when it comes to actually launching something cool. And it doesn't just exist in software. If you look at a lot of CPG companies, a lot of marketing managers are almost like product owners for their specific product line. I also worked in hardware before I worked in software. So there's product managers for hardware as well.
When it comes to software product management, what is kind of the factor that makes someone a rock star or someone like really excel in this? Like, what are the kind of the skills and the attributes of a successful product manager?
Sure. I think the biggest one is really collaborating cross-functionally, right? You're really the one that people are relying on to work with the technologists, work with the scientists, the data analysts, marketing, even sales or the commercial team, as well as customers. And so that's really the biggest piece. If you cannot collaborate or communicate cross-functionally, then you're not going to be a good product manager, period. I think that's a pretty indisputable fact, right? And then I would say the second thing is really understanding the balance between being stringent and formulated and innovative. A lot of the times in product managers love frameworks. We like to use a ton of different frameworks to compare things, to prioritize things. But at the same time, you need to know when to let go of the framework or when to be a little bit flexible on the roadmap to allow for innovation. And that's really, really hard for a lot of people to excel. So a lot of times earlier in product careers, people don't do that. They're executing, but the importance in staying and growing and getting promoted in that field is really understanding like that balance between the two, because product is not exactly an art and it's not exactly a science. It's a little bit of both. And then I would say the third thing is really being a constant lifelong learner, right? We're working in technology in the software space. Things are changing a lot. So there's not really absolute truths that are going to be true forever and always. And so knowing how to keep up with that technology, understanding it and learning it and how to leverage it in different use cases is really critical.
Would you say that product manager or product leader would require to have some sort of a multi-potential or a polymath kind of personality or skills?
Sure, that's a good question. I think if you ask, 10 different people in product how they got into product, you'll probably get 10 different stories. And so, you'll get some people that are, as you described, had multi-potentiality, but then you'll probably get some people that came from a very specific specialization and have expanded that because they're creative, they're open-minded, or they're innovative. So I think really, honestly, you come across people in product that come from all walks of life. And I think there's definitely advantages to a mix. So I've built several different product teams from scratch or things like that throughout my career. And I think it's really important to have a mix of all different types of product on the team, because if everybody is, for example, if everybody comes from a type of that multi-potentiality mindset that you're describing, one of the challenges of the team might be to really focus and double down on what you need to do from a feature development standpoint for your customers, especially if you work in a really specific niche vertical SaaS type area. And then completely flip on the other side, if everybody's a specialist in something, then people might be working in their silos and not collaborating as well because they are an expert in what they do. So I think that mix and that blend is really important. So when I try to build teams, I think it's really important to bring on people with like a yin and yang type personality. Like I never want to hire someone with the exact same strengths and weaknesses as myself, right? I kind of want that yin and yang mix of it.
Awesome. So you mentioned you worked on AI projects even before AI became popular with the release of ChatGPT. So could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I was excited when ChatGPT launched, and I was like, finally. So yeah, there's different areas that I've worked in cognitive computing far before. Was it late 2022 when ChatGPT launched? So in 2007, I was working at UC Irvine in a tissue engineering lab, and we were using AI, and it was like a very early coding to really understand and predict how vasculature growth of capillaries would advance in airway. So really what we were doing is it was artificial tissue or tissue engineering, and we had 3 different types of tissues. And what you do in cell biology is you use different types of cell lines and then see which one is optimal for the application that you want, which is a very manual, long process, which I did not have the patience for, and that's why I never got my PhD. So really, we used some really early prototype code to predict like vasculature growth for different sets so that we didn't have to wait for that vasculature growth over time. So that was really early and a little bit frustrating, but nice to be exposed to it that early. And then in, I think 2014 or 2015, I was with IBM as a strategy consultant, and we were working with one of the large Fortune 500 companies out there, and they were looking to reduce errors from insurance companies to literally get drugs to patients faster, right? So how do you use electronic applications for benefits verification so that large volumes of people can be positively impacted by getting their drugs faster? So we used an early cognitive computing model that we developed. It was very much supervised learning, now unsupervised learning. We had to train the model. And, I'm talking patients with like blood pressure medication, acute macular degradation. So they're taking medication very regularly, but every time they're still needing to verify that through their insurance in the United States to make sure it's covered before they get it. So people really rely on that in their daily lives. So if you could use any type of computing model to accelerate that time to drug product to get it in their hands, if you can improve that like by 80%, that's a significant impact on people's lives. And then I'll just share one last example so I don't bore everyone with a ton of examples. But in 2018, 2019, some of my incredibly brilliant colleagues at Thermo Fisher Scientific had an idea, and we filed an invention disclosure for using machine learning to accelerate scientific review. So basically, brilliant scientists spend hours and hours every week learning how to, or just reviewing peaks, chromatographic peaks, right? I need to try to simplify all the science behind it so that all the listeners can understand. So basically, these brilliant PhDs are spending hours every week looking at peaks, right? But a simple machine learning algorithm can define in about like an 80% level of certainty whether that scientist even needs to look at the peak or not. And then you could potentially leverage, theoretically generative AI to craft what the peak should look like and what the differences or delta was within a given peak. And then you can see what the differences are and then identify the peaks that the scientists need to review. So then this frees up a ton of time for those brilliant scientists to focus more on intellectual tasks affiliated with the flag peaks rather than reviewing, the X amount or the large portion of them that are regular. I mean, there's always challenges to a lot of these things that I just described, right? These scenarios back then was that we had to train models for example, every single drug, every single trial, or every client, right? Because this isn't publicly available data. And obviously, it required huge amounts of data structuring and labeling. But I'm really confident that future technology will evolve into more of a natural intelligence type model that can create more improvements to this everyday work that can accelerate scientific discovery, research, healthcare, things like that.
Tell me about your experience when you start interacting with Gemini or ChatGPT.
When I first started, or as I use it today, because I think I have really improved the way that I'm using it.
Let's have both.
Let's have both. Okay. So yeah, when ChatGPT launched, three like very immediate reactions, right? I was like, this is awesome. I'm so excited this is public. People can stop being afraid of AI, and they don't have to be scared anymore, right? I've been waiting since '07 or whenever that was. But then my second reaction was, oh my gosh, everyone is going to expect it to be accurate and give them answers instead of using it as a tool. And then my third reaction was like, glad this thing didn't launch during shutdown and pandemic because I feel like people would have gone insane on it. So since then, since it was launched, and I was, using ChatGPT, and then I started using Bard, which is now Gemini. So excuse me if I still start calling it Bard because I was attached to that name. I was kind of learning when I learned about encoders and decoders. I learned the difference between the OpenAI ChatGPT is just a decoder model versus Gemini, which is both like a transformer, an encoder, and a decoder. And I thought, at least for the purposes that I use it both professionally and personally, in my opinion, Gemini has been better for my uses and my use cases. And so that's the one I have, bookmark in my browser, bookmark on my phone, using it all the time. And I use it for a lot of things. So if I start with what I use it for professionally as a product leader, there's two main ways to use AI as a product leader, and it doesn't have to always be generative AI, right? So using Bard, which is now Gemini, to draft like outlines of epics and user stories, as well as persona development, it's been really helpful and saved me a lot of time on some of these repetitive tasks to create a draft. Right? It's not going to be the end product, but it's a draft and it saves me a lot of time. I'm a pretty slow typer. So it saved me a lot of time, like typing, for example, right? And then I would say also using something like Coda to run through a lot of data in order to get repeatable calls to AI tools like ChatGPT or Gemini for redundant tasks. I think Coda uses ChatGPT. And so doing a lot of repetitive functions on the back end for product development is really nice. And then I would say another use case is like using like Tome or another tool to save a ton of time making slides. Again, just a first draft of a slide outline or something like that for communication purposes. So that's a lot of back end kind of ways to use it in product. And then I think even like from a customer facing standpoint, right? Thinking of use cases and how to make a customer experience better or save them time. So sometimes I might have really raw ideas that maybe I don't want to bring to my team yet, or I just want to talk through. I might just type those into Gemini and use Gemini as like a co-pilot or a devil's advocate of like, how do you think I can make this idea better or this feature better? What are some of the next steps you would take after this feature, right? Or like, what are some examples that clients would use these features for? And so like, that's where the most fun lies for me professionally in using some of those tools.
I'm glad you mentioned something about like first draft. You're always emphasizing on that because I like from my experience, it's always going to be a first draft, whether it's writing an email or coming up with a headline for an episode or whatever. And a lot of people would be listening at this and saying, well, if I would have to use these tools and continuous to iterate and may as well write it myself and not using them at all. So would you recommend like people to use these tools even if they're not perfect right now, or maybe there are use cases where you don't need to use it at all?
I agree that there are use cases where you don't need to use it at all, but I would encourage every single person if you haven't picked it up and started using it, to try. Um, like a simple use case. I literally just did this with my son this morning. I'm like, let's make a story. Let's make a 2 paragraph story. So I pulled up Gemini on my phone and I said something like, create a story for a 5-year-old that personifies 2 animals doing something in Austin, Texas, and make it 2 paragraphs, right? Um, so it's generating that, talking to my son about it. And I asked my son, like, do you like the animals it shows? It shows something like an armadillo and a bat, which are very common in Austin, Texas, for those of you who don't know. My son said, oh, I'd prefer like a wolf, a baby wolf. So then, you just add that into Gemini and it changes the story and it modifies that. So there's really easy, simple ways where if you're nervous or you think that it's not going to provide value, you could use. I've also used it for like diet and exercise, which is very personalized, right? And maybe I was too lazy or didn't have the time or whatever to hire a personal trainer. Let me just try, right? Like put this into ChatGPT or put it into Bard. I really encourage people to pick it up and start using it. And if you start using it in your personal lives, don't enter any personal information you don't want public in there, which I think is common sense. I hope is common sense. But you start using it and getting comfortable with it with those use cases, right? And then you can get more comfortable in your professional life. But I would say use it. Even especially if you're a creative person, it can save you a ton of time for those early drafts, no problem. And I'll just say one last thing. I was writing an email to somebody, I forget what the context was, but I tend to be very direct in the way I write emails, right? And it was someone I didn't know well. So then I copied and pasted the email into Gemini and I said, can you make this email more concise and in a friendlier tone? And it did that for me, right? So I think there's definitely plenty of ways anybody could try to use it, play around with it to get comfortable.
Amy, you mentioned you have a son, right? And you're thinking about what is the future is going to hold for your children. If this technology keeps getting more and more intelligent, and right now, like probably like 90% of venture capital or 90% of the startups are focusing on making this technology agentive, giving it agency to actually operate in the world. So few years down the line, pretty much like everything would be done by AI in some sort of way. And then we think about, okay, what should we learn? I mean, everything is, AI knows everything. And what should we do? AI can do everything.
Sure, yeah, thanks. I do have 3 children, and in general, I would say I'm optimistic about technology in general, right? I'm a tech geek. I'm often an early adopter of technologies and things like that. But there's a pessimistic component to it as well, and I'll dive into both, right? So I think like things like user experiences, interactivity, a lot of monotonous tasks or repetitive tasks. I'm optimistic about the opportunity of AI and Gen AI to really help make improvements in those areas, right? And really enable and force humans to like level up on what we're doing on an intellectual level. So I know in one of your previous podcast episodes, somebody talked about, it was a professor and was talking about plagiarism, right, from students. And basically what he was saying is that with the rise of Gen AI, the requirement of the intellectual nature of the papers, the points that they're making and the creativity, the bar has been raised now, right? So that you can really see if you're generating a paper that's just generated by one of these generative AI LLM models, like that's maybe like a C or D paper, right? And when you're crafting something that's really intellectually curious and bringing up new points and understanding different perspectives, that's really that like B plus or A level paper. That was the example he used, and I think that you can use that in a lot of our lives. So that's the part that makes me really optimistic, right? Like, and then I would say from the pessimism standpoint, I think that the average user is not like ready to understand the best use cases for this type of technology. And so for that, I mean, we're definitely on the hype curve, right? There's going to be a plateau somewhere. We will stabilize the generative AI hype, and then we'll really start getting into the best use cases for the future to improve lives. And I've already talked about some of them, on this podcast. If you're getting medications to patients quicker, if you're reducing people's times to do monotonous tasks in a laboratory, that's more time for them to like innovate and solve really hard problems, right? Like when COVID hit and the whole world shut down, there were scientists in labs still working to identify the structure of the COVID virus. Like, what does that look like? How do we solve it? How do we create a vaccine? So if you're thinking about a massive event and using generative AI for something like that to help accelerate those problems, then I'm very optimistic about it. And I'll just use one other example. There's a company out there, I won't mention their name, but their vision is really to accelerate scientific research so that drug discovery can go from 10 plus years down to 1 year. And if you can use AI and generative AI to do that, and different types of cognitive computing technology, how could you not be optimistic about the future of the world? So those are the things I'm optimistic on, and really just like pessimistic or a little bit playing devil's advocate on, like, do we know how to use the future of this properly? And my answer is like, not yet. We're still in the learning phase.
Right. But what, in terms of like your children, if someone is finishing high school right now, what kind of major would you recommend them to choose?
That's a tough one, and there's definitely no right answer to that. I think technologists are still have a space, right? I don't think that product managers and engineers are going to be completely replaced by generative AI. Of course, it can write some amounts of code, and it can write these user stories or create these personas. But I think we need to still be able to use those tools in the most effective way. So I think those like more technical fields are still very viable. I think what might happen, and what I hope happens, is actually the cost of education and the access to education, those barriers, I hope, become a lot lower. Like thanks to not just AI and generative AI, but really accessing that type of education, right? Like maybe it's not going to take you 4 years to get a computer science degree in the future. Maybe that can be a lot faster and more accessible for a lot of people, and then maybe a lot cheaper so that people can actually access it. And that's a whole nother can of worms, especially in the US, I think, when we talk about student debt. And then the other part, I would say, like the creative parts, the innovative parts, generating music, art, things like that, sports, those are things that, at least in what we have right now, and I think even in the foreseeable future, are not going to be 100% replaced by generative AI technology. So I think those can even be immensely more valuable in the future when you're looking at pairing that with generative AI technology.
I remember when I graduated, the section where the graduate of business administration / all the soft skills around it, like the specialization within business, right? The marketing, I graduated with marketing degree. The biggest proportion of graduates are still in the business major. What is the impact of this technology on people who have graduated in business, and people who work in these soft administrative jobs?
Sure. Let's use a tangible example, right? You mentioned you were a marketing major. I don't know much about marketing, but I've worked with some brilliant marketing colleagues. And if, let's fast forward 30 years from now, every single person in marketing is using Gen AI for everything, right? They're using it for all their image generation, for their taglines, etc. You still need like the human to create like what's the catch? What's going to like derive emotion from your target customer base? What's going to be a differentiator? Because if everybody is using this as the baseline, then you still need to find something that's making your product different, right? And, using the old business school case study of like Coke versus Pepsi, that's not going to cut it anymore, right? Because everything is going to be, the baseline is Coke and Pepsi, right? And then what is going to make that really pop to your consumers and grow it? And that works for B2B and B2C. And I think that's really where like a lot of human element comes into it. If you think about the LLMs and generative AI, the limitations are still what is the data in the LLM that's available largely out there today. That's the world that we live in right now, right? So that's past data. So if you're generating all your new ideas solely on past data, then you're not innovating. And I think that's really where those more like creative majors can add a lot of value, and where I really lean on my colleagues the most for that have that creative element, that can think of that idea that it's like, oh wow, that light bulb kind of goes on. And I don't think generative AI is going to be doing that even, within the next 3 decades, right? Like it can generate things, but is it going to generate that light bulb?
Yeah, great point. Yesterday, I had a business call with a potential client, and they had a problem that, their HR, they have like two people dedicated to answering really silly questions from the HR standpoint, like something related to employee benefits and stuff like that. And we were talking about, oh, we definitely need to automate these responses. So we're integrating something like a basic automation tool using ChatGPT and Zapier and whatnot to help facilitate this process. But then I was thinking, this is the job of two people that I'm just using automation to eliminate. So the company owner could easily tomorrow, after same day after implementation of this system, to fire these two people on the spot. And I was like, is this a good thing, or like what's happening, or what should these two people do, especially if they haven't had time to upskill or reskill? Or so what's your perspective on that?
Sure. I think that's a really good example in terms of like the introduction of risk. So risk comes into play a lot when you think of applying AI to a problem versus not, right? AI shouldn't be used for every single use case. So in that specific instance, since you kind of laid that out, right, there should be at least one human that's a co-pilot for that. When we're talking about HR, if I'm asking or if I'm typing into my system, I've had XYZ injury, let's say I've had back surgery, right? Am I eligible for long-term disability? Let's say for whatever reason, there's either a hallucination or a wrong answer from that model that says no. Now that employee, and especially if they're in the state of California, is being told false information that they don't have a right that they'll actually, that's probably too basic. It probably wouldn't make a mistake like that. But the risk for that company, if that happens, is enormous, right? And it's in writing. That person is going to sue the company, right? So I think there's a large amount of risk associated with some of like this completely replacing a human's job function with AI. So if you're talking about two people doing that job, let's say if I'm that CEO of that company, what I need to think about is like long term, right? So one is risk. And so can one of those people be the co-pilot with this model to make sure that we're having a good experience? And then that second person, they probably have added a lot of value to the company, right? Where else do we think they can add value? And that's where I need to support, as the CEO or as the leader of that team, how to upskill, enable those opportunities for them, or identify areas. Maybe that person can help work on other projects where AI can help accelerate or save time in those different HR tasks, which I believe that there's a lot in that field. And actually, like just using a parallel in the legal field, they've been using AI, not necessarily Gen AI, but they've been using AI for quite a while, right? But you still see all these people going into legal field, having paralegals, having lawyers and things like that. So I would encourage people to like research and look up like what have other fields done, right? Because we haven't gotten rid of lawyers. We haven't gotten rid of paralegals. They're still there and they've been using AI for a very long time, right? And so just think about like the different tasks or the more advanced things that humans can do to be co-pilots with AI tools, or mitigate risks in certain areas, or maybe identify other opportunities for that technology use.
It's amazing how there's the naive layer. Oh, AI is going to do that, and then when you start digging deeper, things start to appear in a better perspective. So I want to end with a more philosophical question that I tinker with. I read a recent book called The Feeling of Life Itself, and what does it really makes us human, and what is consciousness and all of that stuff. And as these systems become more complex, there's integrated information theory that suggests that any organism or any system that gets there's like a kind of a threshold to the amount of complexity of information that kind of sparks consciousness. What's your take on this? I know probably it's not your domain, but like as a fellow human being, like, do you worry that one day these systems will wake up?
Yeah, it's okay. The reason I laughed at the question, yes, it's not my domain, but I recently watched the movie Life. Not the best movie, but pretty crazy movie with a pretty intense ending. So it's funny that I thought about that movie when you asked that question. So yeah, I think it's the things that make humans want to get up in the morning or get you really excited, right? So it could be going on a beautiful hike in nature. It could be traveling to another country to experience like different cultures, different foods, things like that. Like, you know, we've been able to for some time now put on a headset and go to virtual reality to do this, right? Like that's been around for a while, right? That doesn't, I don't know about you, but that doesn't do it for me. That doesn't float my boat, right? Like I believe you're really into chess, for example, right? You can play chess all day against a computer, right? But I'm betting that you still prefer playing chess with a human a lot of the time. So I think those like feelings and emotions, and even like the innovation that's evoked from those experiences can't 100% be replaced by machines. And that's what keeps us human. Otherwise, we end up in a world that's like the movie Wall-E, which I couldn't get through that whole movie, but I know that there's people just laying down and staring at screens the entire movie. Like if that's what you want your life to be, you can go do that right now. Nothing is stopping you from doing that. And I think it's the human element and the fact that most of us are not living our lives like that already with the technology there means that there is more to life than just interacting with a computer 24/7.
Yeah, the experiences, right? The feeling of life itself. Fantastic conversation, Amy. Thank you so much for your valuable insights.
Sure. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for continuing to iterate that this technology is just a draft and early state, and we need to use it for what we could use it for, but we still need to use our brains. So really appreciate your podcast, and thanks for having me.